Welcome, welcome, welcome to our English-speaking union happy hour, Chaucer, A European Life with Marion Turner. I'm Joshua Kepa Gonzalez, Director of Branch Services at the English-speaking Union of the United States, and today's happy hour is sponsored by the Cleveland branch of the ESU. As ideas for these lectures come from you, our members and viewers, please share any ideas or topics for an upcoming speaker or talk using the survey that will appear at the end of our program tonight. Before we get into that program, I wanted to make a couple of quick technical announcements. After the presentation, we will be holding a question and answer session. You can enter your questions into either the Q&A module or the chat module. Buttons to either of these are located at the bottoms of your Zoom screen. You can do this at any point during the presentation. It doesn't have to be during the Q&A portion. We will get to questions in the order received. In addition, all attendees will be receiving a special discount code to get 30% off Marion's book. So make sure you stay until the end of the presentation to get that code and the link as well. I also want to take a moment to recognize the branches with the most registered members for today's happy hour. Those are Atlanta, Central Florida, and Philadelphia. Now, to really start us off today, I'd like to welcome President of the ESU Cleveland branch, Bill Kennedy. Bill?
Thank you, Josh, and welcome to everyone from the Cleveland branch. Before we get into the happy hour program itself, I do want to take this occasion, it being the 21st of April, to acknowledge the 95th birthday of Her Royal Highness Queen Elizabeth II. And so this, I know, is a difficult time for her with the death of Prince Philip. On behalf of the English-speaking Union of the United States and Cleveland branch and all of its members, I would like to rise and offer a toast in honor of her birthday. I give you the Queen for the Queen. Happy birthday. Our guest this evening comes from Oxford, which I feel I know very well, having watched so many episodes of Inspector Morse and lately the Endeavour series. I think I could get myself around Oxford without too much trouble, at least perhaps from pub to pub, if nothing else. And throughout the quadrangle and the various colleges, I first became acquainted with our guest tonight, Marion Turner, through a review in the TLS that was very favorable of her most recent book. Marion Turner is she's a fellow of Jesus College at Oxford University, had been a student at Magdalen College, where she is a professor of English literature at Oxford University. And her book, Chaucer, A European Life, was released by Princeton University Press in 2019 to very wide acclaim. The British Academy awarded it the Rosemary Crashaw Prize. It was shortlisted for a number of prizes and was also considered to be the book of the year by very many of the British publications, and very favorably reviewed, I must say, by the TLS, which is always a good recommendation as far as I'm concerned. April 17th in 1397 was the occasion of the first recitation, or perhaps we would say reading, of Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales at the court of Richard II, some 624 years ago. So we celebrate on April 17th that anniversary. And it is fitting, I think most of you, many of us in our academic career had to memorize the prologue, the general prologue to the Canterbury Tales. Juan that Aprila, with his shoulders sutta, the Rochte March hath pierced to the Ruta. And please forgive me, I know many of you could probably do that much better than I. But here in Cleveland, we woke up to 5 inches of snow this morning. So it's not exactly the most pleasant April that we've ever spent with Chaucer. But I do want to just now introduce Marion to you all and turn it over to her. She's going to be speaking about her book and about Geoffrey Chaucer, and I'm looking very much forward to it. Thank you very much, and welcome, Marion Turner.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for that introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to everyone who is attending. I really love this concept of the happy hour, and I hope that many of you are drinking your Bellini cocktails while you're listening to this talk. I'm not having one myself at the moment as I need to keep my focus on my talk, but I suggested the Bellini because I'm going to be talking today a lot about Chaucer's European travels, his international context, and the Bellini is a cocktail that I associate very much with Italy. So I just thought, first of all, it would be a nice drink for thinking about those European travels that none of us can take at the moment. But then when I thought a little bit more, I remembered that, in fact, it's even more appropriate because the Bellini is particularly connected with Harry's Bar in Venice. And I myself, many years ago, remember drinking a Bellini in Harry's Bar on my honeymoon. And the Canterbury Tales begins in another Harry's Bar, in fact, the Tabard Inn in Southwark. This inn, so a pub hotel in which the Pilgrim Company meet, is run by Harry Bailey. So it's extremely appropriate to be drinking Harry's cocktail as you listen to a talk about Chaucer tonight. So without further ado, I'll move on to talk a bit about Chaucer's European life. By any standards, Chaucer lived an extraordinary life. He lived through the plague, the Great Revolt, also known as the Peasants' Revolt, the usurpation of the crown. He was a prisoner of war, an MP, a diplomat, and he always worked for a living while writing reams of original poetry on the side and doing things such as inventing the iambic pentameter in the evening in his spare time. Now, biographies and popular ideas about Chaucer, they often depict him as a patriarchal figure, the father of English literature. And this is the image that many people have of Chaucer. It's a sober, sensible, old man of letters. And the other traditional way that people think about Chaucer is they think about him as a kind of genial, middle-aged man telling risque stories in an English pub. But these ideas about Chaucer are posthumous ideas. This isn't how people thought about him in his lifetime. This image that I'm showing you now is a posthumous image. It was made after his death, and it doesn't reflect the Chaucer that people thought about during his lifetime. In his lifetime, Chaucer was an innovative, pioneering, edgy poet. He wasn't seen as a traditional patriarch. And equally, Englishness is not what defines him. So I think about the two aspects of the father of English literature. People wouldn't have thought about him as a quintessential English poet during his own lifetime. On the contrary, he was steeped in European poetry and traditions, and he lived a profoundly cosmopolitan life. So when I set out to write my biography of Chaucer, I was interested in thinking about Chaucer's internationalism, in the whole sweep of his life, in trying to inhabit his mindset and his imagination throughout his life. So my biography is in fact structured through places and spaces. Each chapter is a place or a space. Some of them are real places, such as Genoa and Florence, for example, that Chaucer went to, that mattered to Chaucer. Others are more conceptual spaces, such as the inn that I was just mentioning, or even more abstract, imaginative places. One chapter is about the Milky Way, for example, because Chaucer was fascinated by astral travel and wrote very frequently about astral journeying. So I tried to think about his mindset, to plunge into these different places, and many of them are places that we can still visit today. We can footstep after Chaucer. And I spent quite a lot of the time when I was researching this book trying to go and visit some of the places that he had walked around, literally to follow in his footsteps. So I'm going to talk today about just a few of the places and spaces that mattered to Chaucer. And I'm going to start with an institution known as the Great Household. And given what great households were like at this time in the 14th century, I think we should perhaps not be thinking of Chaucer like this image that I'm showing you now, but instead should be thinking of him as more like this. So what was the great household? The great household was not one place, one house. It was an institution. In the Middle Ages, a great lord or lady, including the monarch, but also other great nobles, would gather around themselves an affinity. And this large group of people, so family, but also retainers, so high-class servants, friends, all kinds of people, and then a huge retinue of real servants, grooms, cooks, those kinds of people. This huge group of people would travel around from residence to residence, taking with them all kinds of products, making huge demands on local economies as they moved around, but also putting a lot of money into local economies as they moved from house to house. And a great household was really a mini economy all on its own. Now, Chaucer's first job was in a great household. When he was a teenager, he became a page boy. He entered the household of Elizabeth de Burgh, who was the Countess of Ulster and was married to Lionel of Antwerp, one of the sons of the king, Edward III. So as a page, as a member of the great household, Chaucer had to live in public. You didn't go to work and go home from the great household. If you worked in the great household, that was your whole life as a page boy. So he slept there, he ate there, he was dressed by his employer, he moved around the countryside with her and her entire household. Now, the very first Chaucer life record is about his work in this household. So there's a large volume of Chaucer life records that tell us information about his life. And the earliest one has nothing to do with his poetry or his job as a customs officer or anything like that. It simply tells us that at Easter 1357, Elizabeth de Burgh paid 4 shillings for a paltock for Chaucer and 3 shillings for black and red hose and a pair of shoes. Now, this was entirely normal for a great lady to be clothing her attendants. And this is a record that has been known about for a long time. As I say, it's the earliest life record. Nothing new about this record. But when I started researching this chapter, I was looking at this record and I was thinking, well, what are these items? You know, what is a paltock? And people hadn't really thought much about that before. So I looked at lots of other contemporary records to try to find out just what Chaucer was wearing as a teenage boy in this household. And I found out that these were scandalous items of clothing. Many contemporary chroniclers, so churchmen writing about the times, wrote about paltocks specifically, and they were horrified by them. These were chronicles written in Latin. I'm quoting the published modern English translations. So John of Reading, a chronicler at this time, wrote that paltocks were extremely short garments which failed to conceal their arses or their private parts. The Eulogium chronicler wrote about parti-coloured and striped hose which they tie with laces to their paltocks. They go about with their loins uncovered. So young men in the 1350s and 1360s were going about in these short tunics and long 2-coloured leggings or tights laced up together provocatively so as to emphasise the genitals indecently. And John of Reading went on to blame this fashion for incurring the wrath of God and bringing the plague back to England. So, I mean, if you think about the fact that today a lot of people are certainly talking about the fact that young people are being blamed for the spread of COVID, saying they're not taking social distancing as seriously as those of us who are older. But in the 14th century, people were saying that young people's fashions actually caused the plague. It's really quite extraordinary. And this fashionable teenage Chaucer is not the Chaucer that people expect. A young man in these outrageous clothes lounging about a great lady's household, causing people to look askance at these new fashions. And I think that this is an interesting anecdote for a number of reasons. I mean, it's obviously a funny anecdote, but it also seems to me to sum up the kind of frisson between the familiar and the unfamiliar that is a fundamental part of reading about the past. So on the one hand, I think when we study the past, when we read about the past, one thing that tends to be very appealing and interesting is when we make connections, when we think, well, nothing really changes. Just like now, many of us as parents or grandparents might criticize your young people's fashion choices. Many of us were told ourselves when we were teenagers that we shouldn't be wearing certain clothes. It was just the same in the 14th century. These older people want to attack young people's fashion choices. Plus ça change. But on the other hand, this is not familiar at all, because Chaucer didn't choose to wear these clothes as part of a teenage rebellion. He had no choice about this at all. He couldn't express his identity or his individuality through his sartorial choices as young people can today. On the contrary, he had to wear these clothes. They were given to him as part of his job. He had to live in public in a way that would be very alien to us today. Chaucer had to understand what it was like to be an object, to be essentially part of someone else's identity. He was wearing these clothes not to express himself, but because Elizabeth de Burgh wanted to express herself by having these fashionable attendants. So Chaucer knew at this very young age what it was like to exist to serve the desires of others, to live in a public way, not to be able to choose where to sleep, what to eat, what to wear, not to have a room of his own. He would have had no concept at this age, and for much of his life, of the idea of going to your own room, shutting the door, having privacy. Chaucer often wrote in various ways about subjection. And I think that is a really important concept, to think about what it was like for people in this era to be subject to others, to give up what we would think of as an important part of our privacy, because people didn't think about privacy in the same way in different eras. And so I think to try to understand Chaucer's life and Chaucer's texts, it's really crucial to make imaginative leaps, not only to think, well, there's so much that's familiar, which there is, but also to remember the times when, in fact, things are very, very different. And thinking about those experiences that Chaucer had of subjection, of living according to other people's desires, in an even more extreme way, Chaucer, in fact, was himself imprisoned at one point. He learned about very extreme loss of autonomy, about what it meant really to give up his own freedom completely. Now, that imprisonment in France was the first time that we see Chaucer on the continent, when he was fighting in the 100 Years' War, was captured and imprisoned, was then ransomed by Edward III. Now, most of his travel was not for fighting, it was for talking, in a way that his first trip to the continent, where he was imprisoned, was a bit of an anomaly. There's some records of some fighting later on, but in general, I don't think fighting was really Chaucer's forte. He was a diplomat, he was a peacemaker, he made connections, he talked to people. And so most of the trips that he took were to do things such as make marriage alliances for the king, to negotiate wool treaties, to negotiate peace treaties, those kinds of things. So diplomatic missions. And many of those trips were to Italy, one of the most important places for Chaucer politically, economically, imaginatively. And when he went to Italy, he encountered Italy's politics, its culture, its economics, lots and lots of different things. His Italian trips are perhaps some of the most famous of Chaucer's trips. I'll just say a little bit about them. So Chaucer's first trip to Italy, this is the kind of art that he almost certainly saw. So this is a fresco by Giotto, and it's in the Bardi Chapel of Santa Croce in Florence. Now, when Chaucer was in Florence, he was negotiating with the Bardi family, who were a great banking family at this time, and indeed were the bankers of Edward III, for whom Chaucer was working. So this fresco is in their chapel, where it's very likely that Chaucer worshipped when he was in Florence. Even if he didn't, this is the kind of art that he saw, early experiments in perspective. And I think this is very interesting to think about the fact that Chaucer went to Italy, and he went there to negotiate with these bankers, and also in Genoa to negotiate about a wool treaty, which the Genoans wanted to make with England. So he was there on economic missions. And when he visited places such as Florence, he experienced city-states, going somewhere which did not have a monarch, but was ruled by an oligarchy, which is also an interesting kind of political experiment for Chaucer to see. Now, culturally, he saw these early experiments in perspective. I think that's particularly interesting because Chaucer himself was fascinated by perspective, by the idea that what you see depends on where you are standing. And if you move, literally or metaphorically, you will see something different. And that idea of looking at multiple perspectives, of trying to see different people's points of view, is really fundamental to Chaucer's writing. So this is his first trip to Italy, where, as I say, he goes to a city-state, he encounters in all kinds of interesting culture. On his next trip to Italy in 1378, 5 years later, he goes to northern Italy, which was ruled by the Visconti family, a family of tyrants. So this particular image comes from Pavia near Milan. So when Chaucer visited Lombardy, he went to negotiate with the most notorious tyrants of the day. So in contrast to his visit to places such as Florence a few years earlier, he was now visiting an absolutist state, an area ruled by tyrants whose atrocities and brutality to their own people was absolutely notorious throughout Europe. Chaucer, a little later, repeatedly wrote about the tyrants of Lombardy, specifically naming Bernabo Visconti in The Monk's Tale, and also writing about the tyrants of Lombardy in the prologue to the Legend of Good Women. So these were the people with whom he was negotiating. And you can see here, so this image that I'm showing you here is the Visconti family's coat of arms. And if you go to northern Italy, you will see this everywhere. I took this photograph, it's a photograph of a ceiling in a room which was the library in one of the great palaces of the Visconti. But you can see this image just stamped all over the walls of Milan, on pottery, on jugs, just all over the place. Now, if you've seen coats of arms before, which of course you have, you'll know that when you see most coats of arms, you see things like unicorns and lions rampant going like this, that kind of thing. But when the Visconti made their coats of arms, they depicted a kind of serpent dragon figure swallowing someone whole. And quite often the person they're swallowing whole is in fact a child. And you can see that here. And one thing I think is very interesting about this image is that the Visconti are essentially saying, in case it's not completely clear, we are the baddies here. They are defining themselves by their monstrosity, by their aggression. They're saying to people, fear us. This is who we are. So this was the group with whom Chaucer was negotiating. And while he was there, under their auspices, he was able to encounter, get hold of all kinds of extraordinary poetry. So it's quite uncomfortable, really, to think about what that must have been like for Chaucer to have been getting access to all of this wonderful poetry that was absolutely to transform what he could do in his life, in his career, now to be getting access to lots and lots of works by Dante, by Petrarch, by Picacho, but to be doing this while negotiating with these people who we know that he despised their politics, as became clear later. So I think that that juxtaposition between culture and oppressive politics is a really interesting thing to think about in Chaucer's visit to northern Italy. When we think about Chaucer's travels, it's important to remember how different European geography was in the 14th century compared with today. When I've just been talking now about Italy, of course, Italy was not one country, as I hope I've made clear. We have the northern Italian Visconti realm, and we have the city-states that I was talking about. There's also the papal states. There's lots of different parts of it. And that difference in geography, we can see all over Europe. It was very hard when I was getting the maps drawn for my book, because the borders changed all the time. During the 100 Years' War, we see changes constantly. So it was very difficult to know at what point to freeze the map and draw the borders. And many countries existed in Chaucer's day that that don't exist anymore as independent countries. A country such as Hainaut, for example, is now split between Belgium and France. Most people will not have heard of it, but it was a crucial place in Chaucer's day. Edward III's wife, Philippa, came from Hainaut, and Chaucer's own wife, another Philippa, also came from a Hainaut family. Philippa de Roe came from a Hainaut family. So Hainaut was a crucial place at this time in Chaucer's life, but doesn't exist now as an independent state. And another place that was really important in Chaucer's life was Navarre, that does not exist anymore as an independent state. So in 1366, Chaucer travelled to Navarre, which was in northern Spain, and it's now subsumed into Spain as a whole. So when Chaucer went to Navarre, he encountered a place quite different from anywhere he had been before. And one of the most important differences was that here he encountered an ethnic mix unlike anything that he had previously experienced. So this photograph here is a photograph that I took in Olite. So Olite was the capital of Navarre at this time. And Chaucer's safe conduct was issued in Olite. So we know he was there. He went to the palace and got this safe conduct from the king, Charles. Now, this street abuts that palace, Charles's palace. And as I hope you can see on the PowerPoint, this street is the Rua de la Judarea. You can see that on the white sign there on the wall. It was the street of the Jews. Now, England had brutally expelled its Jewish population in the late 13th century. So Chaucer was not used to living in a country with people from other religions. But when he went to Navarre, he experienced a country where the Christian rulers coexisted fairly successfully at this time alongside Jewish and Muslim communities. And although I do not think that the situation of those different communities was ideal, there were all kinds of problems. Nonetheless, these different groups did cooperate to make society work at this time, and the treatment of Jews and Muslims in Navarre was much better than it was in other parts of the Iberian Peninsula, or than it was in many parts of medieval Europe across these centuries. So, for instance, when proclamations were made, they were made in markets and city squares on Thursdays, in mosques on Fridays, synagogues on Saturdays, and churches on Sundays. So we can see that attempts were made to accommodate different cultural norms. The day before the king issued Chaucer's safe conduct, he issued a proclamation ordering the Jews of Pamplona to take in the Jews from the countryside, because he knew the invading soldiers from Aragon might target them. So in his travels to Navarre, Chaucer did experience what we might call a multicultural community, a community that was often riven with problems, but that also worked in a basic way. Now, in Chaucer's reading, his multicultural influences and multilingual sources were crucially important. For example, he at one point translated a Latin translation of an Arabic text that he knew. He knew it was originally an Arabic text written, in fact, by a Persian Jewish scholar. So Chaucer was aware of a whole wealth of learning and languages stretching beyond Europe and into many different languages. Chaucer himself, like all educated Englishmen at this time, was multilingual. All educated Englishmen in the 14th century were at least trilingual, so in English, French, and Latin. Educated English women would have been at least bilingual in English and French. But Chaucer had something else, and it was Chaucer's knowledge of Italian that set him apart. Now, it was unusual to know Italian well. Chaucer almost certainly learned Italian because he was brought up in London amongst merchants, not at a court. And in London, there were many, many merchants, bankers, traders, people who'd come from Italy. And that's almost certainly where Chaucer picked up his Italian. And then later in life, when he moved over to a more aristocratic realm, when he got positions, first of all, in the household of the king's daughter-in-law and son, and then in the king's own household, he was then in a position to be sent on trips to Italy. almost certainly he was sent because he did have good Italian, and then he traveled with Italians and presumably perfected his knowledge of the language even more then, because he certainly did know it very, very well. We can see that from what he does with Italian texts. So it was his knowledge of Italian that meant he could go on those trips, acquire these manuscripts, and then start to do the kinds of things that he did in English poetry, because he really couldn't have transformed English poetry in the way that he did had he not had access to Italian poetry. Petrarch was important to him. Dante was extremely important to him, but Boccaccio, above all, was Chaucer's greatest source and influence, whom he uses more than any other source. Now, Boccaccio mattered to Chaucer and to English poetry, both in formal and in content-based ways. So, for instance, Chaucer invented the iambic pentameter, the 10-syllable 5-stress line, da-dum, 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 that became the fundamental building block of English poetry, used by Shakespeare, used by many, many poets for hundreds and hundreds of years. And he developed that 10-syllable 5-stress line in the wake of reading the Italian 11-syllable stressed line. So he read that in poems such as the Teseida, and after that he starts developing his long line, which really changed English poetry. He also developed various verse forms, again adapting, not copying exactly, but adapting things that he'd read in Italian poetry. And in content as well, his poetry drew on all kinds of Italian sources. He used Boccaccio's Teseida for the Knight's Tale, the Philostrato for Troilus and Crusade, for example. And the Decameron, I think, is a crucial source for thinking about the Canterbury Tales. And looking at the Decameron, Boccaccio's Decameron, really helps us to see the true innovation of what Chaucer was doing in the ways that he differs from Boccaccio. So the Canterbury Tales is, of course, a tale collection where you get a group of tellers who all tell tales. And it's a brilliant genre because it allows the author to present lots and lots of different kinds of material all put together. Chaucer was, of course, not the first person to write a tale collection. And one of his great predecessors in writing a tale collection was Boccaccio. Now, the Decameron is a tale collection in which 10 tellers each tell a tale for 10 days. So you end up with 10 tales a day for 10 days, 100 tales. It's a brilliant collection, but it's also very different from the Canterbury Tales. And the crucial difference, I think, is in the nature of the tellers. So when Boccaccio's tellers get together, what we are told, they all meet in Santa Maria Novella, another church in Florence. When they get together, we're told that they are all young, beautiful, related to each other, friends, gently born. And that's the really important thing. They are all gently born. They are all from a high class. They are all from the authoritative area of society, exactly the people in society who have a voice, who you expect to have a voice, whose stories tend to be heard. Now, this is not the kind of group that Chaucer is interested in. His tale-telling group is not like that at all. When he puts together the Canterbury Pilgrims, there's one person from relatively high in society, the knight, not that high. There's one person at the bottom of society, the ploughman. Everyone else is from what we might think of as the middle classes, the middling kinds of people. There's a merchant, there's a lawyer, there's a cook, there's a miller, there's a sailor, all those kinds of people. And the idea behind the Canterbury Tales is that many different people have the right to tell a tale. So at the beginning, it starts hierarchically. There's a kind of fixed lottery, so that the knight, the person of highest social status, gets to tell the first tale. After his tale, the host, Harry Bailey, says, well, that was great. The person of highest secular estate has told the first tale. Now the next one should be told by the most important cleric, the monk. And at this point, the miller, who has had one too many Bellinis, or rather beers, intervenes and says, no, I'm going to tell a great tale. I might have had a few drinks, but I've got a great story to tell. Don't stop me telling my tale. So the drunken miller intervenes and asserts his right to tell a tale. And everyone says, oh, well, all right, tell your story. So the miller tells his story after the night, and the miller's story is brilliant, it's hilarious, it's packed with beautiful, interesting imagery, and it mocks and parodies the Knight's Tale. And in one way, it's a different version of the same story. They both tell the story of a patriarch and a love triangle, but they tell it in different genres from different points of view. It's an example of the way that we might not fully understand our own material. Someone else can take that material and do something else with it. And crucially, after the Miller's Tale, we don't return to hierarchy. This isn't an aberration where someone bursts in and then we go back to social hierarchy. Never do the Canterbury Tales return to a sense of order and hierarchy. They proceed according to their own logic. Someone will interrupt and say, well, I want to tell a story that will rebut what you just said. Sometimes Harry suggests that someone tells a tale. Sometimes the group shuts someone up and someone else comes and just decides to tell their tale. But it's a proto-democratic way of telling tales, and it asserts the importance of hearing multiple voices, of not just listening to voices of authority, but allowing different kinds of people to be heard. So Chaucer came back from his European travels and he wrote in English all these wonderful poems. But when he came back to England, in fact, he went on living what I would call a European life. He lived a European life when he was at home, as well as when he was abroad, because his life was always embedded in European contexts. You can see here the Thames, the river in London, and Chaucer grew up watching the ships come in and go out again on that river. They came in laden with products from all over the world, spices from Indonesia, all kinds of fabrics, silks from the east, and also things such as, grain and timber and lots and lots of different things that came in. And they went out laden mainly with wool, English wool that spread across the world and created England's wealth. The building that you can see here is, of course, the Tower of London. Chaucer was in charge of the Tower of London's upkeep as one of his jobs. And next to it was the Customs House, where he worked for many years. And when he worked as a customs officer, he was in charge of the wool custom. So his job involved thinking about the movement of goods in and out of England, thinking about export and import, about what came in and what went out. Looking at the ships, he worked on the river, looking at those ships, thinking about this constant movement of goods, about global trade, because trade at this time was indeed global. Things came via many middlemen across thousands and thousands of miles. But Chaucer's London, when he was a child, was in Vintry Ward. So just a little bit further west from here was the ward, the area in which Chaucer was born. As the son of a vintner, a wine merchant, he lived in Vintry Ward. And that was the ward that had more immigrants in it than any other ward of London at this time. It was a multilingual space. It was a space of trade. So for many, many times in Chaucer's life, he lived and he worked on thresholds, looking out to the river. When he worked as a customs officer, he lived over Aldgate, over one of the gates to the city. So looking into the city and out to the countryside. It was the gate under which the rebels flowed in 1381. And then he walked down from his office to the river and looked out right across to the wider world. And that sense of his living on a threshold, I think, is really important. I mean, one of the key points I think that I was trying to make throughout my place structure in the biography was to emphasize just how outward facing and global Chaucer and his writings were. Very different from the nationalist image that history and the canon have tended to confer on him. Chaucer was always interested in looking both ways, in making connections. And if you will indulge me for a moment with a little bit of Middle English, I want to talk again about thresholds a little bit. So this is from The House of Fame, one of Chaucer's most experimental poems and one of his most fascinating poems. It's a poem which is about someone called Geoffrey. Now, it's not an autobiographical poem exactly. It's about a kind of avatar, a persona of Chaucer's. But this persona is called Geoffrey and is a poet and works in accounts, as Chaucer did at this time. And Geoffrey has writer's block. That's what the poem is initially about. and an eagle, a Dantean eagle, seizes him, takes him up to the heavens and gives him lots of advice. And one of the things that the eagle says to Geoffrey is that he's not doing the right things for his writer's block. He says, "But of thy very neighbours that dwell in almost at thee doors, thou hearest neither that, ne this. For when thee labour doon all is, and hast mad all thee reckonings," that's his accounts, when you finish doing all your accounts, "instead of rest and new things, thou goest home to thee house anon, and as dumb as any stoon, thou sittest at another book, till fully dazzled is thee look." So the eagle says to Geoffrey, you're doing it all wrong. You just, when you finished your work, you just go home and you shut your door. And then as you become, your senses all become numbed. You're dumb as a stone. Your look is dazed. You're not listening to what other people are saying. You hear us neither that nor this. All you're doing is reading your books alone, shut away. And what you should be doing is going to your door and listening to your neighbours. Now, Chaucer, of course, thought it was crucially important to read books, and the House of Fame itself is heavily dependent on Virgil, on Ovid, on Dante. But he also thought it was important to think about new things, to listen to stories, to listen to oral culture, to think about what kinds of stories different kinds of people might have to tell. And what he suggests here is that you shouldn't shut yourself away in an ivory tower or in a room of one's own. That in fact might be a bad thing for creativity, contrary to what many people have thought in modernity, where there's been a general idea that people need privacy and quiet in order to be creative. Chaucer suggests here that collaboration, that listening to others, that communicating with others is what really matters. And I find that quite poignant in this time of the pandemic, where we've all been longing to do more communicating and collaborating. And thank goodness that we do have these computer screens which allow us a bit of that, though of course we'd all rather be actually in the doorways talking to each other. So when I think about Chaucer, I don't think about the father of English literature. I think about a boy in fashionable skin-tight trousers, a man riding across the Pyrenees in winter, a father of actual children who wrote a scientific tract of his son and visited his daughter in her nunnery. This is her nunnery in London. I think about an experimental poet, a man in a room of books over the gate at Aldgate in London, a traveller in Italy devouring manuscripts in a Pavian library, a 17-year-old prisoner of war in France. Chaucer was many things. And it would have seemed very odd to him to be remembered as the didactic father of the English canon. He was an innovative internationalist and one of the greatest of European poets. Thank you.
Thank you for that wonderful presentation, Marion. I very much enjoyed it. And we do already have people chiming in with their questions. So if you have any questions that you'd like to ask, please enter them into the Q&A box or the chat box, but I'll just start because we already have a queue of questions lined up. So from David Coslow, is there a connection between the hypersexualized male attire that Chaucer, a youth, wore to please his lady mistress, and the cod pieces, particularly the Spanish cod piece, that the courtiers to Queen Elizabeth wore? Did powerful women in this fashion subjugate their men in their fashion?
That's a really interesting point. So the cod piece itself is a later development. People weren't wearing cod pieces themselves at this time. I think that idea of, is this a specifically gendered dynamic? It's an interesting idea. I think it's not the case that only female employers are addressing young men in this way. So I don't think we could see it exactly like that. But of course, there might have been a particular frisson of that when you do have a powerful female employer with young men, you're choosing to have these attractive young pages in that way. And I mean, one thing that people are often surprised about is just how powerful some women were in Chaucer's day, that Chaucer himself had these female employers, that his wife always essentially worked. She was a lady in waiting. They lived apart for much of their lives. His mother owned property. Widows in London had a great deal of power. England had good inheritance laws for women. So powerful women were really important in Chaucer's life and times.
So this is actually, I'm going to segue into another question that I think just ties in with it. How did Chaucer fare during the War of the Roses, given that his sister-in-law was firmly in the Lancastrian camp?
So I think you might be talking about his granddaughter Alice there. So the Wars of the Roses post-date Chaucer. So Chaucer himself is so Chaucer himself lives, of course, throughout the 100 Years' War, and at the end of Chaucer's life, Henry IV took the throne from Richard II. So that's the beginning of the Lancastrian dynasty, but people would usually see the Wars of the Roses themselves starting in the middle of the 15th century with Henry VI and Edward IV. So although we can see them as having their origins back in Chaucer's day, the Wars of the Roses are not themselves happening until a little bit later. But Chaucer, in his own lifetime, very much had connections across both camps, and the Lancastrians mattered to Chaucer hugely because John of Gaunt was, I argue in my book, the most important person across Chaucer's life. Now, John of Gaunt's son was Henry IV, and Henry IV's son was Henry V, who was the father of Henry VI. But John of Gaunt was in fact the ancestor of both sides in the Wars of the Roses, and he ended up being the ancestor of the Tudors via Chaucer's sister-in-law. So this is a really interesting aspect of Chaucer's life, which is that Chaucer's wife's sister was the long-term mistress of John of Gaunt. John of Gaunt was the son of Edward III. As the long-term mistress of John of Gaunt, Catherine Swynford, Chaucer's sister-in-law, had 4 children with him. And then later in life, John of Gaunt married Catherine Swynford really scandalously, because people didn't tend to marry their not very important mistresses of who they had for 20 years as mistresses, but he married her, got the children retrospectively legitimated, the only time that's been done by Act of Parliament. But there was a special clause saying, although they'd been legitimated, they couldn't ever claim the throne, but they were in fact the route by which the Tudors claimed the throne. They were the Beauforts. Margaret Beaufort was the mother of Henry Tudor. That's a separate issue to Alice Chaucer, whom I think the question was perhaps also referring to. So that so Chaucer's son Thomas was brought up largely with John of Gaunt's children in this extended household. He then became speaker in Parliament, and his daughter Alice was one of the most important women in the 15th century. She became a duchess, and she switched sides, very, very effectively. Was a Lancastrian for one period, but then later in life was in fact the jailer of Queen Margaret, the Lancastrian queen. And when the marriage that she'd set up for her son with a Lancastrian fell through, she then married him to a Yorkist instead. So she, a bit like her grandfather, was a very good political operative.
So that actually segues really nicely into another question that you mentioned in that answer was, I have heard that Chaucer and John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, were very close friends. Could you comment on the nature of their relationship?
Absolutely, yeah. So there's a chapter in my book on Lancaster. So Chaucer met John of Gaunt first when Chaucer was a page. So we know that they met very early in life, as teenagers. They were a similar age. So they knew each other throughout their lives. And before Chaucer's sister-in-law had this connection, Chaucer already knew Gaunt. Was fighting on similar campaigns with him, and became a member of his household, not in the sense that he lived with his household, but in the sense that he received payments from Gaunt and did things for Gaunt. As I already said, the crucial aspect of his relationship with Gaunt was the fact that his sister-in-law had this long-term sexual relationship with Gaunt, and Chaucer and his wife both got a lot of favors from Gaunt in the wake of that really, really important relationship in Gaunt's life. I mean, she was clearly the woman that Gaunt loved. Gaunt's other 2 wives were political marriages. Chaucer's first or earliest extant long poem, The Book of the Duchess, is an elegy written in the wake of the death of Gaunt's first wife, Blanche of Lancaster. A beautiful poem about loss and mourning, and one of the only times that Chaucer writes really, really clearly about a real event. Although of course it's refracted and distanced, it still does clearly refer to that real political event. And throughout Chaucer's life, Gaunt gave him favors. He got Chaucer the job in the customs office. He was the person in charge of the government at that time. First of all, his father was senile, and then his nephew, who became the next king, Richard II, was a child, was only 10 when he became king. So John of Gaunt was really in charge of government for a period of time. So he did a lot for Chaucer. He did even more for Chaucer's son, who went with Gaunt to Spain in the 1380s, and then Gaunt arranged an extremely lucrative marriage for Chaucer's son. I don't think that we can necessarily think of them as friends, in that this was very much an asymmetrical relationship of power. That doesn't mean that they could not have been friends, but I don't think we can assume that they were, because there was a real power dynamic going on there. But Gaunt certainly did a lot for Chaucer, and I think that really Chaucer's relationship with Gaunt was the great constant throughout his life that survived all kinds of changes and vicissitudes of fortune. His Gaunt was always kind of there for him, and he gained a great deal from that relationship, and it was really more important than his relationship with any of the kings, I would say.
So our next question is from Vernon Danielson, who I think he asked us at a very specific point in the presentation, which was this building built in Chaucer's time? And I believe he was referring to the building in Olite that you showed. Was that building around during Chaucer's time?
Oh, okay. So let me just flip back. So the actual building that I'm showing there, that is not the palace itself. That is a medieval building. Yes, that is a medieval building. The sign is obviously sorry, I'm trying to get out of my PowerPoint now. The sign is not a medieval sign, of course, as you can see, but it does represent sorry, I've just lost my Zoom. I'm getting back into it now. Sorry, but it does represent a street that was the Street of the Jews in Chaucer's time, although of course that's a modern sign on the building.
So on that same kind of point about geography and being in the location, when you were traveling this is from Clark Goodwin from our Atlanta branch, who asks, when you were traveling on the continent for your Chaucer research, what was the typical length of time you spent in an area such as Navarre? Were you able to reach out to local researchers and historians, and were they helpful?
Right. So no, that wasn't really the kind of traveling that I was doing. I wasn't really there trying to look at documents. Most of the documents I tended to be able to access via libraries in the UK, usually in the Bodleian or online. And the time that I spent on those trips was much more simply about walking through the spaces. So I was also, when I was doing that research, my children were quite young, and I would only go away for like about a week at a time. I would do lots of short little trips rather than going for a long immersive kind of trip, because that would just not have been possible for me. And so what I would do was really just spend a lot of time in the spaces. And when I went somewhere like Olite, for instance, I suppose some of the things that I got out of that experience was, first of all, looking at all the things that were so familiar, so I'd look at kind of the Roman walls, the church iconography, and think just how familiar that must have been for Chaucer, all very similar across much of Europe, very similar to Northern Europe. But then thinking about the Jewish quarters and the Muslim areas, and how that then would have been really so much more alien to Chaucer. And while I was in Navarre, I went to the mountain passes so Chaucer would have ridden across the Pyrenees into one of through the mountain passes, probably to Roncesvalles. There were other mountain passes, but probably there. And there was a huge contrast. I tried to go at the time of year that Chaucer had gone. So I went to Navarre in February, which is when he went, and tried to think about what it must have been like to ride over the Pyrenees when there were wolves and bears there. Of course, I wasn't traveling like that. But I still found that I still struggle in some ways to articulate why that kind of footstepping helped me so much, but it really did. The kind of just immersing myself in, even for a short time, just spending a lot of time simply walking the streets that he walked, trying to reconstruct what had been there, what hadn't been there when Chaucer was there. I found it enormously helpful for trying to get inside his imagination, even when I went to places where the ravages of time had really had a great effect. You know, in Milan, for instance, the remains of Bernardo Visconti's church is on a kind of traffic island now, and you have to kind of dodge across lots of screaming taxis, and then you get to this little traffic island where there's the remains of the church, but you go down, and it's actually quite a wonderful metaphor, I suppose, because the history is still underneath, the crypt is still there. You can still experience some parts of the medieval kind of under the modern surface. So there was so much that helped me a lot, but in some ways, it wasn't as concrete as talking to local researchers and finding specific things out. Often it was more of that, a sense of just trying to bury myself in Chaucer's imaginative world. What did he see? What was it like?
So our next question is from David Coslow, who asks, did Chaucer have the same concerns that Lyle, Spenser, and Shakespeare had several centuries later, that the English language needed fresh blood or a larger expressive vocabulary? And the solution was to bring into English new blood drawn from Italian, French, and Latin.
Yeah, absolutely. So Chaucer was in fact so newfangled that he invented the word newfangled. He's the first person that we have a record of using it. So yeah, there's a moment, for example, in one of his short poems where he's translating a French poem, and he says, rhyme in English has such scarcity. You know, he talks about the fact that it's so hard to rhyme in English because we just don't have the kind of vocabulary that French has. Now, of course, now English's vocabulary is far bigger than French vocabulary, because English vocabulary expanded so massively. And what Chaucer is partly doing is, it's a kind of humble brag where he's saying, you know, it's so hard, and yet look, I'm doing it. I'm inventing these words, I'm coining words, I'm developing the language. And I mean, there were lots of other people doing that as well at this time. There's the time of a great flourishing of literature in English, where we have many people writing in English at this time, not only Chaucer, but yes, the language was very much expanding in these decades.
So our next question is, how did people read these tales, since most people could not read then, in terms of the Canterbury Tales, I believe?
So okay, so there's lots of different things to say here. So first of all, most people are not reading them, unfortunately, despite all of this. Everyone should have the right to tell their own tale. We should listen to all kinds of points of view. You know, most people, your average ploughman is not accessing the Canterbury Tales, undoubtedly. Nonetheless, it is important to say that literacy levels were a lot higher than people often think. So in London, for instance, at this time, it's been estimated that about 50% of people were literate. That literacy might not have been highly developed literacy, but it was a basic level of literacy. So people were more educated than is often imagined. However, you didn't even necessarily have to be able to read to access the tales, because many literary texts were accessed through the ear rather than the eye at this time. So in this kind of manuscript culture where it's so hard to get a copy, if someone had a copy of a book, they would be likely to read it aloud to a group of people. And so that might be informally, where someone is reading out loud to a group of friends or family, but also texts would be read in places, not only in courts and great households, but also in places such as inns, such as the real Tabard Inn. There would be readings of these texts that people would listen to, and then they would discuss. So, you know, rather like book clubs and so on today. And I think it's a great way of reading texts, of course, is to read things in a group and talk about them. And you can see various moments in the Canterbury Tales where that's being overtly encouraged. You know, one of the tales, the Franklins, ends with a question: who was the most free, who was the most generous of the characters here? The Canterbury Tales often stages debates where the pilgrims discuss what the tale was about and react to it and so on. And that's also what would happen in the actual groups that were listening to the Canterbury Tales.
So Elaine Wise asks our next question: how did he come to know women's agency so well?
Well, I mean, it's a really interesting question. So, I mean, I think that there's lots and lots of possible answers there. Um, as I mentioned briefly before, women were, many women, the kind of women that Chaucer knew, had quite prominent roles in his society. So at this time, there were in England and in other parts of northwestern Europe in particular, there were good inheritance laws for women. You know, women were protected by the law in many ways, and there were powerful women. There were women who worked. There were women who could inherit, you know, really quite substantial wealth from their husbands and who were protected, unlike women in many parts of Southern Europe at this time, for instance, where inheritance laws were much weaker. So he was very much acquainted with many strong women. But it is very noticeable that in his texts, he is interested in thinking about the female point of view, in thinking about women's subjectivity and agency. And that's very striking in a text such as Troilus and Crusade, where he takes Boccaccio's text and he makes the heroine much more sympathetic. He thinks about what was it really like for this woman who was being traded between men, being exchanged in a war zone. Why did she betray Troilus? What choices did she really have? And he really tries to get inside her head. And in The Wife of Bath, his most famous woman, I mean, he's doing a lot of interesting things with The Wife of Bath, but to single out one moment, you know, one of the important things that The Wife of Bath says is, well, women haven't had the chance to tell their own story. You know, the pen has been in men's hands, essentially, as many later writers have said as well. But The Wife of Bath says, you know, who painted the lion? Who has had the pen? Who's had the authority? Women haven't been able to say the truth about men. Men have always been attacking women. And Chaucer was clearly, you know, really interested in this, in getting the perspectives of people whose perspectives were generally not considered. So just as he was also interested in hearing the voices of people of lower classes, he was also interested in hearing the voices of women who didn't usually have a voice in textual culture. And I think that partly that is simply something about his, you know, very expansive interest in multiplicity. You know, one of the things that he says in the Canterbury Tales is diverse men, but he means people, diversely they said. The idea that he is so fascinated by diversity. He doesn't want only to hear one perspective, whether that's one class or one gender. He really is interested in trying to understand what makes a range of people tick.
Great. So our next question is from Margaret Fletcher. It is rather open-ended, but how did a page morph into such an important person? And I'll just put a plug in here and say, read the book to find out, but I'll let you answer that now, Marion.
Yeah, well, so a page, I think in some ways we might think of a page as less important than they really were. These were quite desirable roles. So even though you didn't get paid a salary, you just got your clothes, as I've said, and your food and somewhere to sleep. But these were roles that allowed young men to learn the rules of society. So they were quite desirable jobs. You weren't doing really servile work. You might run some errands and so on, but you were also there just to kind of look decorative, and you might do some sword play. There might be tutors in the household who would give you more education. There were, you know, you would learn poetry. So it wasn't a kind of a really servile kind of service job. It was tended to be the first rung in the household. So it was quite I mean, it's more interesting as to how he got that job in the first place. So after being a page, then progressing further on in household jobs, I think for someone who was clearly so extraordinarily, incredibly intelligent, talented, versatile, it's not surprising that he then did well, got a role in the king's household, was sent on diplomatic missions, because he was clearly so capable, you know, knew so many languages, was such a brilliant talker, debater, and so on. It's more interesting in a way, as I say, that he first got into that kind of household from a city background. He then moved into this high aristocratic household, and that was probably a bit of luck, a bit of his father, who had a job provisioning some of the king's castles with wine. So in his job as a vintner, that probably gave him some connections with the court and enabled him to place his very clever, able son. And then I think once he had a place, he was off. You know, he was able to make his way because he was, you know, so bright.
So I think that dovetails really nicely into our next question of what was Chaucer's education prior to joining the house?
So he went to school. So we don't, as I said, our first actual fixed life record for him is within that household, but it is certain that a boy such as Chaucer went to school. So there were grammar schools at this time. There were several grammar schools in London which he could have gone to. For example, the one attached to St Paul's Cathedral, that may well have been the one that he went to. It would have been convenient. It had a lot of good books attached to it. We have records of that. So a child such as Chaucer would, in his early years, very likely have learnt to read at home, but then gone to grammar school for several years. The education there would have been mainly in Latin. And after that grammar school education, he then would have continued. He didn't go to university, as far as we know, at any point, though the universities have often tried to claim him. But he would have continued his education within the great household, where there were further, opportunities to study, to work with tutors, and so on. But one of the interesting things I think about the grammar school education is, I think people often assume that education before the 20th century really was a lot about kind of rote learning. And a lot of education in Chaucer's day was about debate and questioning. The classroom was often a kind of theatre for debate, where students were encouraged to take different points of views, to take a fable and give different morals and argue against the morals and talk about different possible meanings for text. So it was a much more questioning environment than I think people might assume.
So our next question comes from, actually, Roberta Klein has asked two questions, so I'm going to kind of package them together. So given Chaucer's travels, how do you view Chaucer's Prioress's tale? Is the prioress the anti-Semite, or, say it ain't so, is it Chaucer himself? And the next question is also, what do you make of the rape allegation against Chaucer?
So, I mean, these are both really important questions, and this really is a kind of read the book. There's so much to say here. So first of all, the Prioress's tale. So as many of you know, but some may not know, the Prioress's tale is a monstrous anti-Semitic tale, which tells the blood libel that has been retold so many times in anti-Semitic texts. And so some people would say that anti-Semitism was so common in Chaucer's time that this is voicing an opinion that almost everyone had. That's not what I would say. So I think that Chaucer satirizes all of his pilgrims, and he goes out of his way to make it clear that none of the pilgrims is giving Chaucer's own opinion. So what the prioress is giving is her own opinion, and it is clearly extremely limited and narrow. In her prologue description, it's made clear that this is someone with a very limited understanding of life and of religion. It's a very sentimental and narrow idea of religiosity. And within her tale, Chaucer goes out of his way to make it clear that this is her point of view. So twice in her tale, he inserts a quod she, which he almost never does in the Canterbury Tales. So he really, emphasizes, look, this is her speaking. This isn't me speaking. And the tale itself is one of the most extreme versions of this story. It's a story we have many other versions of from the time. The prioress's version is the most extreme. So in other versions, quite often, I mean, they're all terrible, but quite often the Jews convert at the end. Sometimes the Jew who committed the murder in the story is executed, but in the prioress's version, all the Jews who knew about the murder are executed. So it's this mass atrocity. It's a worse, it's a even more monstrously cruel story than the other versions. And all of this emphasis on revenge, on there's lots of language around revenge and violence that comes directly, a few lines before the prioress then pleads repeatedly for mercy from God for herself. So I think it's very satirical and in what it's suggesting about the kind of person that she is, that she does not see the connection between her absolute refusal to think about mercy for others and her demands for mercy for herself. So I think obviously she is an anti-Semite. Was Chaucer an anti-Semite? I mean, I think ultimately we can't know, but I don't think this tale shows that he was. I think this tale, like all the other tales, is the viewpoint of a teller, and I think it is a misreading to suggest that tale tells us what Chaucer thinks. It is an unknowable, but I would certainly emphasize the fact that he shows the prioress as a monstrous and intellectually numbed and limited kind of figure. The rape allegation. So Chaucer was accused of the raptus of Cecily Champagne and essentially paid her off and was released from those charges. So for a long time, people debated whether this raptus was an abduction or a rape or a sexual rape. And this is, I mean, it's an annoying answer, I know, but essentially we just don't know what happened. And many critics are very keen to come down on one side or the other. So it used to be people who were very keen to say he couldn't have done it. You know, and people who say, look, you know, she and people said terrible things about her, you know. Yeah, I mean, there's not time to go into this in great detail, but on the other hand, you now have people today who say, you know, very much, oh, he was a rapist. You know, there's no such thing as a false accusation. You know, he was a rapist, and I think that does misunderstand the legal situation in the Middle Ages, which was quite different to the legal situation today in terms of what kinds of evidence you needed to make these kinds of accusations, and also around different possibilities. So that a recent critic, for instance, has linked the case to some wards that Chaucer had, people that he was whose marriages he was in charge of. There are different things that may have happened. There are certainly other cases at this time where a raptus accusation was made when we know that the crime was not sexual and there were other reasons for making those kinds of accusations. So it is an unknowable, and I think it is something that it's important for us to acknowledge that this is something that we can't know, and to, you know, reflect on what we want and try not to let that, you determine what we think about it. But I think we can never know what happened between Chaucer and Cecily Champagne.
Well, thank you, Marion, for all of your. So we do have some questions left. I'm sorry that we won't be able to get around to them. We're already over our run time by almost 15 minutes at this point. So I want to thank you for taking some time to answer our questions. I also want to direct everyone to the chat where you can find the link as well as the discount code to purchase Marion's book at a 30% discount. I'll be sending that out in the email that follows. So if you can't click it there or don't have access to it, you will be receiving it in your email. But now I would like to actually invite our executive director of the English Speaking Union, Karen Karpovich, to say a few words. Karen?
Hi. Thank you so much, Marion. And one of the things that popped up, one of the questions that popped up was, we have to go back and read Chaucer. I mean, it's someone who we tend to read in school, and then we tend not to revisit him after we've reached a certain part in our life. And I think you've kind of engaged us in the possibility of going back and reading some of those stories. Thank you again so much. And I want to thank everyone from Bill Kennedy for connecting you with us. And I hope that in your journey and in your studies, if you are going to talk about anything else or explore anything else, we'd love to keep in touch and see if you could visit us again, and maybe come visit us in New York, visit us in the United States with our speakers program. If you're ever in the United States, we'd love to have you here visiting some of our branches. Thank you again. I also wanted to mention the fact that our next speaker is Shake Up Shakespeare, which is on May the 5th. And that sounds like it's going to be a fun, interesting event at 4 o'clock with a lady named Carol Ann Lloyd, who is going to take us through some interesting things on Shakespeare. And that's kind of timely because this Monday is going to be our National Shakespeare Competition at noon Eastern Time. So if any of you, everyone knows about our National Shakespeare Competition, but if any of you, it's always in New York and it's at Lincoln Center, and during COVID, we've been doing it via Zoom. So we're able to expose a lot of people that have never seen it before. So at noon on Monday is our National Shakespeare Competition with students throughout the United States, participating high school students in our competition. So I would encourage you to explore that because that's a fun, interesting event. And again, I want to thank you. And I also want to say, the English Speaking Union is a membership organization. And if you're not a member, we'd love to have you as a member, and you have an opportunity to sign up for membership when you fill out the form. Thank you all very much, and happy birthday again to the Queen. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.